So I want to welcome you. I'm not a big reader, but I was fascinated by this book and the story behind it. And so I'd like to welcome you, Jason. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a conversation. Jason Bell's going to talk a bit about the book. I'm going to ask him some questions, then we're going to open it up for questions from the audience here. And there's about 40 to 50 people in the audience here, so it's a nice turnout. So would you like to start off by giving us a taste of the book?
Absolutely. And let me just also begin by thanking you, Lance, Renee, and David, and of course the Book Break Committee. And I'm really delighted to be speaking with the audience in Toronto. One of the scenes in the book where Winthrop Bell is fighting the Nazis during World War II happens in Toronto. So I'm really happy to be speaking with your community. And just a quick note that if anybody, when they're reading the book, wants to drop me a note, I'm easily findable on the internet. My email address, I'm at UNB. Just Google my name, Jason Bell, and my email address pops right up. So yeah, I'd like to begin with reading the prologue to my book, and then I look forward to our conversation to follow. On Sunday, March 19, 1939, Winthrop Bell opened his basement vault and stepped inside through an imposing green steel door designed for a bank. He lifted a file holding copies of still classified espionage reports he had written for the British Secret Intelligence Service 20 years earlier. He knew how to manage the risk. Sealed behind a massive lock, the papers were safe from thieves and Gestapo spies. In his hand were London's first warnings about the Nazis, written during his mission to Berlin. He locked the vault behind him and returned to his basement study. Because he had built the house on land sloping down to the harbor, the back wall was at ground level with 2 sunny windows and a door opening onto the garden. He looked out one window and took in a commanding view of Back Harbor in Chester, Nova Scotia. Bell was half a world away from the Nazis' violent, racist Berlin. 20 years earlier, the Secret Intelligence Service, better known as MI6, had sent him on a classified mission to that dangerous city teeming with democratic heroes and terroristic villains. His assignment was to gather intelligence about the situation in the German capital, where people were still licking their wounds after their defeat in the First World War. Gradually, he had gathered threads of evidence, hints from sources, and interviews with aristocrats, politicians, bureaucrats, military officers, soldiers, scientists, and ordinary citizens. Woven together, he revealed a secret group with a dangerous plot. Now, 20 years later, the terrorists controlled Germany. Bell's democratic sources had been murdered, exiled, or were working underground. In 1919, some powerful British bureaucrats had been incredulous of Bell's warning. The Nazis were, at the time, attacking Jews from the shadows and weren't perceived as a threat. Officials decided to bury Bell's report under a restrictive top-secret classification rather than release it to the public as he had hoped. 2 decades later, he still kept a copy in his vault. The other copy was stored in the British Foreign Office's secret library. By the spring of 1939, the Nazis had grown strong enough to plot a war of revenge against the entire world. But they kept their plan and their ultimate purpose, the Holocaust as we now call it, as their most closely guarded secret. Bell was the first to decipher their code, just as he had been in 1919. He knew he needed to put his retirement on hold so he could thwart the Nazis once again. Bell added his 20-year-old intelligence reports to the stack of documents on his desk. Next to his typewriter lay a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf in German and transcripts of recent speeches by leading Nazi officials. He picked up his pen to add to the notes he had drafted for what would be the world's first published warning of Hitler's plans for worldwide genocide. He flipped through the pages of the file from the vault until he found the words he had typed when he was Secret Agent A12. He translated the German shouts he remembered from listening undercover on the first secret Nazis in Berlin. Hatred, revenge, uncompromising enmity, these must be our watchwords. Then he reread the words he had shared with his 1919 readers, men and women with top secret clearance. They know very well that Germany is herself in no position to gratify this desire. The reactionaries know that their hour is not yet come. The more far-seeing would wait a long time yet. 2 decades later, Bell felt no better that he had been proven right. Now he needed to make up for lost time. Bell had not read Mein Kampf when it came out in 1925 because he was busy teaching philosophy at Harvard University. But once he brought his full intelligence to the Nazi Code in March 1939, reading between the lines of Mein Kampf and recent statements by leading Nazi officials, cracking it was surprisingly easy. Hitler could not come right out and say what he meant to do with conquered populations because it would provoke overwhelming opposition. So he and his top leaders spoke in a secret language that made the plan clear to their fellow racists while leaving everyone else in the dark. For instance, Hitler cleverly pointed his followers to ancient historical examples in which conquerors had slaughtered defeated populations. Bell, as expert in history as he was in the German language, saw the implication that Hitler left unstated. By piecing together historical clues with other data, Bell deciphered a secret message that had fooled the world for 14 years. But revealing the Nazis' hidden intentions was the easy part. It remained a far greater challenge to convince others that the German Führer seriously meant to obliterate all non-Aryans, and that the scope of his plan extended far beyond Germany and even Europe. It would be a difficult picture to paint. In late April, he was still at work writing his warning. His diary recorded him pruning trees and then listening to Weber's Oberon Overture, Haydn's Oxford Symphony, and Brahms's First on the radio. He made cocoa during the Brahms intermission, but distracted by his conversation with his wife, Brahms was vigorously played but too rushed in many places, he told her. He accidentally used salt instead of sugar. Then he sat back down to work, but once in a while he looked out at a heavy spring snow that made the view from his office beautiful. Eventually, he turned to his typewriter, which stood solemnly at the center of his desk. The repairman had visited on April 21st, 1939, to ensure it was in top form. First rate again, Bell noted, after months of wretched functioning. The tuned and oiled machine stood ready to fight the Nazis. He rolled a sheet of paper into position. The room transformed from silence to the machine gun fire of his practiced typing. In the spring before the war was launched, the murderous final solution to the Jewish question still had no name. The Führer described it only by hints and implications. Bell named it Hitler's extermination program, and its scope, he typed, was worldwide. This was the first clear warning of a strange fact that most people still do not realize today. Hitler and his allies meant to destroy all non-Aryan races on every inhabited continent of Earth. By the end of the Second World War, the Nazis had killed approximately 20 million innocent people, not including combat deaths. But that was far short of the number they had hoped to kill. Even before the war began, Bell knew they aimed to massacre hundreds of millions. And yet, as the Holocaust historian Jürgen Matthias notes, in September 1939, no one, not even seasoned observers of pre-war terror, had a clear idea what the Nazi regime's next step towards its goal of solving the Jewish question would be. And in her book, Beyond Belief, The American Press and the Coming of the Holocaust, Deborah Lipstadt shows there are no known earlier warnings about the final solution in English language newspapers. Before 1942, she explains, journalists understood Nazi extermination to mean deportations of Jews and occasional murders to frighten other Jews out of Germany. She writes, no one could imagine even in 1941 that it would soon take on an even more diabolical meaning as the systematic and complete murder of European Jewry. And as Andrew Nagorski writes in Hitlerland, people had no inkling of the Nazi plan, even though today, he writes, it's conventional wisdom that Hitler's intentions were perfectly clear from the outset and that his policies could only result in World War II and the Holocaust. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, American visitors to Germany did not see Hitler's ultimate purpose. For those who met him, Nagorski writes, he was not some abstract embodiment of evil, but a real-life politician. But Bell knew. And he alone, in early 1939, knew enough to give a startlingly accurate warning that Hitler meant to kill all Jews and non-Aryan peoples everywhere in the world. Agent A12's clear view at a time when the Nazis proclaimed a desire for peace no doubt owed to his close-up observation of the Nazis in 1919. He had seen their hidden essence months before Hitler was even a player in the movement. And now, 2 decades later, Bell realized that the race war would not stop with the Jews. Next on their hit list were peoples like the Poles, Ukrainians, French, Russians, Czechs, Slovaks, Asians, and blacks. All non-Aryans, he typed, were to be quite literally exterminated. And that's an emphasis in the original, quite literally exterminated. This was, in Hitler's depraved imagination, the only way to protect German blood from racial poisoning. Hitler's European policy, Bell typed, is thus merely the first stage. Hitler planned to murder non-Aryans in North America, just as surely as he meant to destroy them in Europe. Bell knew that if the Nazis won the war, SS troops would one day be in Nova Scotia to round up the Jews and other minorities, as well as liberals like him. But this time, unlike 1919, he had an important advantage. Now, he was no longer a professional spy, but a private individual. No clueless government bureaucrats could censor him. That is the prologue. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. That gives us kind of an overview of the book. So I'm going to start off. First question I'd like to ask is, how did you first learn about Winthrop Bell, and what motivated you to do such extensive research to write this book?
Well, it was an accidental discovery. So I was interested in interpreting between two fields of philosophy, pragmatism from North America and phenomenology from Germany. They were invented about the same time, a few decades apart, around the beginning of the 20th century. And they seemed to me, when I was reading them, to have a lot in common, too much to be a simple coincidence. And so I had a hypothesis that the university city of Göttingen in Germany might have something to do with the linkage between them. So some of the pragmatists had studied there in the 1800s, and then Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, a Jewish philosopher at Göttingen, had been in residence there in the early 20th century. And I decided to make a trip there. I thought maybe I could find books that had been in the library that both of them might have read. I wasn't expecting too much. This was in 2008, and I was looking through the archives, and there I found a dissertation by Winthrop Bell that explained the pragmatists to the phenomenologists. So this had been the discovery that was had motivated my research for about 10 years at this point. I began work on this in the late 90s, so I was really taken with this discovery. But the Göttingen copy of Winthrop Bell's dissertation was missing 2 pages. So I found that Bell's papers, were housed at Mount Allison University in Sackville, New Brunswick, but they were under restriction. And at the time, I had no idea why they were under restriction. There can be financial reasons, banking reasons, personal reasons. I had no idea why, but I wrote to the president of the university and I asked for those restrictions to be lifted so I could go in and do research. The university agreed. A couple of weeks later, I learned years later that that was after they had checked with Britain's Foreign Office to confirm that these were no longer classified documents. But I went into Mount Alice in 2008 looking for the missing pages of the dissertation, which I found. I saw that Bell had been in a lot of places at the right time. So he knew Albert Einstein and Max Born, Nobel Prize winning physicists. He knew the founders of major philosophical movements. So that was what really captivated me. I saw right away that Bell had been a spy for MI6, but I was like, that's just kind of an interesting thing. It wasn't at all the center of my focus. But a few years later, after I'd gotten some of Bell's philosophical works published, just out of curiosity, I started reading his intelligence report and was just astounded that he was describing the initial formation of the Nazi Party before Hitler had even joined the movement. So this was about 6 months before Hitler became a kind of a minor player in the movement. Bell was describing leading factions in Germany that were supporting this anti-Semitic movement. And there was nothing in the history to document this. Of course, there could not have been anything in the history because Bell's papers were under restriction. And then I looked at what he was doing in 1939, and I saw that he had written these warnings about the upcoming Holocaust years before the next warnings had come out. And that was when I really realized that I was going to have to shift my focus from my original discipline, philosophy, to look at the historical implications of his work. So I really started looking at that about 2012 and spent another decade or so researching that in order to write the book. So about 15 years all told from the beginning of being at the University of Göttingen, looking at Bell as a philosopher, to bringing the book to the Canadian reading audience.
So why was so little known about Winthrop Bell, who you described as one of the world's greatest spies before you published?
Well, there were two fundamental reasons. So one of them was that his papers were held under restriction, so scholars simply couldn't get into them. The archivist at Mount Allison University knew about this, but as I've learned in my research, archivists have tight lips. So when they're asked to keep secrets, they do it. The other reason is Bell was offered a prestigious honor. So he was offered membership in the Order of the British Empire in 1920, and he refused that honor. And I speculate in the book as to why. My leading hypothesis is because at that time, those awards were published in newspapers, and that would have blown Winthrop Bell's cover, and it would have compromised his sources. So as it was, he refused the award. Only MI6 and Britain's Foreign Office and some key figures in Canada, including the Prime Minister Robert Borden, knew what he did. The public was clueless. And that was a real advantage to him when Hitler took power. So Winthrop Bell was able to get into Germany in 1934, the year Hitler seized absolute power, to be able to write further intelligence reports, which would have been impossible if he had accepted the honor. And then I said there were two reasons. A third one was he just didn't mention it to people. So when he volunteered to work in the intelligence service again in World War II, he wrote to his former spy master, Morris Hankey, and he said, I haven't talked about this to anybody. And I talked with members of his family who knew Winthrop Bell, and they said he never talked about it. He never mentioned this period of government service, so he really kept to the Official Secrecy Act. And so those were the three reasons that this remarkable figure who, as I argue in the book, helped win World War II, simply has not been known until now.
Right. So he could have chosen after his incarceration in Germany. So you mentioned he was incarcerated for about 4 years, I believe, and then he returned. So he could have returned to become a professor in Canada at Harvard, the U.S., but he chose to become a spy. What in his personality led him to make this dangerous choice?
Yeah, so so Winthrop Bell had, when he started his studies with Husserl was hardly known in Germany. While Winthrop Bell was publishing him, Husserl published a book that made him the major philosopher in Germany. So he became, Husserl, as the founder of phenomenology, became a big deal, internationally known. And Harvard and Toronto were competing for Bell's services. And that was what Bell was planning on doing, was getting kind of the first boat back to North America and taking up a career as a philosophy professor. But after he was released from prison in late 1918, he went to London. He met with Prime Minister Robert Borden, who was a family friend of his from Halifax, and reported to Borden what the internal situation was like in Germany. And Bell was not only a keen observer of politics and of German culture, but he also, Winthrop knew quite a large number of people who had held key intelligence positions within the German military. So when Bell had been a graduate student at Göttingen, he befriended leading mathematicians and physicists, among them people who later went on to win the Nobel Prizes. And when World War I broke out, those people were pulled from the front lines, if they ever got there, and were put to work by Germany in their military intelligence and technology bureaus. So these were people who trusted Winthrop completely from the pre-war years. Many of them were Jewish. They were liberal thinkers, and they saw the danger of this anti-Semitic violent movement that was taking over Germany, and were telling Bell right away what was going on. When Bell reported these things to Robert Borden in London, this was news. So London didn't know this, Washington, D.C. didn't know this, Ottawa didn't know this. And so Borden asked Bell to cancel his steamship tickets back to Halifax and to stay on while he tried to make something happen. And what the something was meeting with the Foreign Office to get Bell hired on in the Intelligence Bureau. The initial offer that came through to Winthrop Bell was going to be for a desk analyst position in London. And Winthrop turned it down. He said if he could not get a dangerous posting in Germany, he wanted to go back and be a philosophy professor. And the Foreign Office accepted his request and let him become the first intelligence agent, the first British intelligence agent, British Canadian, of course. He was a Canadian citizen and a British subject. He became the first British MI6 agent to go into Germany after the war.
So what made him so good at spy game?
There's a few things. So one of them, as I suggest in the book, he was trained in phenomenology, which is in its original incarnation, and it's still loyal to this today. It's about getting over bias so that we can faithfully see the truth. And Edmund Husserl said this, sounds easy, but it's remarkable how much bias and baggage we can bring with us. So the phenomenologist entered into a kind of a purification period to get rid of all the bias that had afflicted them beforehand, so they could really see things as they presented themselves. So it's really a study of what evidence is and how to be loyal to evidence. And so Bell had spent 4 years with the founder of the movement. This is one of the major movements in philosophy nowadays. But Bell worked with the master. And then during the whole period he was incarcerated in Germany, he was doing heavy and deep reading and phenomenology and doing all kinds of researches. So just incidentally, and I hope to return to this one day, but Bell's phenomenological analyses of evidence while he's in prison are just remarkably perceptive. Nobody knows about them because he was writing for himself. But it's really how good intelligence is done nowadays. So good secret intelligence. The second factor, as I mentioned, was he happened when he was a student to befriend these leading physicists and mathematicians, and his circle of friends and his intellectual curiosity was such that the Germans were very suspicious of him. They thought that he was a British spy. And there was a period in 1911 where he could have gotten himself killed. The Germans arrested him. and accused him of possible sabotage operations. But all the evidence shows that Bell was just friends with these people in math and physics because he was interested in math and physics. He had a background at Mount Allison in mathematics. And there was nothing more to it than that. He didn't see that the war was coming when it did come. He did not anticipate these people would be recruited into intelligence. But they were, and they trusted Winthrop absolutely completely. So Winthrop was a real, true blue, loyal friend, and they trusted him with state secrets. And one of the things that they were describing to him is the takeover of Germany during the latter part of World War I by a racist, anti-Semitic, and anti-Slavic faction run by General Erich Ludendorff, who was the virtual dictator of Germany. These were things that you couldn't read about in the newspapers. They weren't diplomatic documents. This was all top secret and classified, even within Germany. And Bell only could discover this by word of mouth from these top secret sources. And then the third factor is Bell was a remarkably hardworking individual. So as I describe in the book, he would oftentimes go to sleep at 4 a.m. after meeting with his sources and typing up his reports. Sometimes running through active battle zones to get to these interviews and to get to the telegraph office. He'd go back to his hotel room and he'd sleep for 2 hours and he'd wake up again and he'd do it all over again. So if he had not been that hardworking, there just was no way for him to have been able to piece the story together. He was putting in these astounding work weeks, never taking a day off. And just working himself into a state of absolute exhaustion. He caused himself some heart problems. When MI6 would kind of force him to take some time off, in his diary you can see him like bitterly complaining about it, that he's being asked to rest for a couple of days. He knew he needed to be out there gathering the story.
So one usually thinks of code being words that say something but mean something else. And as in the secret code, such as the Enigma code breaking machine decipher. Why did you name the book "Cracking the Nazi Code" as opposed to something like unearthing or realizing the Nazi master plan?
Sure. So the quick answer to this is I meant to be loyal to the kind of original notion of what a code is. Nowadays, a lot of times people think of it in relation to the Enigma code as being cryptography, where people write what they mean in plain text, and then they trust a machine to encrypt it so that nobody can understand it. But that's not all that code is. And for instance, I'm writing another book right now about World War II OSS operations in Bern, Switzerland, and in Hungary. And OSS Bern knew that the Nazis were able to read their traffic, and so they coded their messages in other ways. You could read these messages, and they use words to mean different things. And so this is a code that spies use. Parents use it when they're talking in front of their children, etc., where you use innocuous language to mean something else. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to say code was because while I was writing this book, anti-Semitism and assorted modes of racism were on the rise. Now, there was nothing like what they've become in the last couple of years. I was not anticipating it was going to get as bad as it has gotten with physical attacks and attempted murders on the streets of North America. But there was, as I was writing this book, a rise in the kind of coded language that we now call, dog whistles, of people, trading memes that, if a teacher in a high school picked up a phone and looked at this, they wouldn't realize it was hostile racism. And so one of the things I want to do to point out about the title is to show the way in which racists can gather strength communicating with one another in this period in which people don't yet realize that they're a threat. And after a while, of course, Hitler no longer thought he needed to speak in a code. He could just come out in the open and say these things. But for a long period of the Nazi gestation, there was this pattern of speaking in code, Why? Because Hitler needed to reach a mass audience who could support him in the Holocaust. So this wasn't an encrypted message he could send to one person. He needed thousands and thousands of people who would join his movement and implement the technology of the Holocaust. So one of the things I'm curious about is how that could happen, how genocides can take place. And I think that one of the things that's going to be prerequisite is you need a group of people, not just one single person, to implement this. And so the problem for that group is going to be how to coordinate this so they understand what's going on, but the rest of the public is clueless. And one of the things that I was working on while I was writing this book in an academic sphere was how the Canadian General Romeo Dallaire, who was trained in French culture, and he knew a lot about Rwandan culture, was able to pick up these codes that were going out over the radio. So again, these are not, ones and fours and eights. You could listen to this as somebody who spoke French, if you were in Rwanda just before the genocide there went on, and it would have seemed totally innocuous. But Dallaire, because he had made a special project of understanding the culture, was able to understand this coded language, meant it was time to go and conduct race massacres. So I don't want this just to be a history story about what happened from 1919 to 1944, but I want it to be a story about how evil people gather evil people to do evil things, and how we can be cautious, and how we can oppose this in its early stages. And I think one of the ways to be able to expose this in the early stages is to be able to understand the codes that are being used and to broadcast that, so these groups are going to meet opposition before they can become too dangerous and too powerful.
Thank you for explaining that. So you talked a bit about, and I was going to ask you, how would you elaborate on Bell's proposals for recovery plans for Germany in 1919 and the outcomes that are ignored? Why his warnings in 1919 and 1939 again were not heeded and made public? Had they been heeded, how would world history be different?
Well, I try to show. Let me kind of answer the second part first, then go back to the first part. So Winthrop Bell's warnings were heeded by influential, powerful people, including the British Prime Minister at the time, David Lloyd George, the future Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the head of MI6 at the time, Sir Mansfield Smith Cumming, and Bell briefed Stuart Menzies, who became MI6's head during World War II. And there's clear evidence that a lot of people believed him, but his plan was blocked by other people. And this is one of the things that I've seen in Britain, not just in that time period, but also what was happening in World War II. The OSS, the American Secret Intelligence Agency, was a lot more efficient because they were kind of a one-stop shop, whereas in Britain, there were all kinds of people who could veto all kinds of plans. So even though Bell personally briefed the UK Prime Minister David Lloyd George, David Lloyd George was the leader of a grand coalition that had different parties, and the foreign minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, were members of different political parties, so David Lloyd George couldn't just do whatever he wanted. But there's very clear evidence that in 1919 and early 1920, the British government figures who supported him were getting him to the right places to meet the right people. Bell learned when he asked for his plan to be declassified that somebody had blocked it. He never found out who blocked it. I was able in declassified documents in England to find out who the bad guy was. And it turns out that was one of the architects of the appeasement of Hitler in World War II. He signed on to a letter of friendship before World War II, arguing that Britain should become friends with Nazi Germany. So the person who blocked Bell's plan with a veto, he was the permanent undersecretary of the Foreign Office, was just one of these many, many people who could veto the plan, even over the heads of very powerful people. And yet, what I try to show in the book is that Bell's plan to the people who heard it was effective. So Winston Churchill, for instance, in early 1920, went before Parliament with Bell's intel saying that there was a 1 million-man secret army in Germany that Churchill used to frighten the parliamentarians who were on the brink of decimating Britain's fighting forces. And so Britain, as Bell said during World War II, had gotten a lot of flack for not opposing Hitler earlier, but Bell justly said Britain was the first to oppose Hitler. And in part, that was from these warnings that Britain was getting in 1919 and 1920, when the Nazis already existed and they were pretending to Britain through secret channels that they were an anti-communist force. And Bell said, they're lying to you. This is not an anti-communist force. They've already lined up with the communists. Their plan is to fight a war of revenge a generation in the future after they've been able to prepare their artillery and their tanks and so forth. And again, Bell was briefing not just on the intelligence side, but also senior military figures. And you can see Britain was the nation that was pacing German military expansion when other nations really believed Hitler proclamations through the 1930s that he was a pacifist who wanted nothing but world peace. And then to jump back to the earlier part of your question, so Bell's plan, and in the book I say this was the formal basis for the Marshall Plan after World War II. Bell said that German democracy, which was tolerant, respectful of diversity, and desperate for friendship with the West, Britain, Canada, the United States, that there were all these well-intentioned people, but the democratic population of Germany was being systematically starved to death. There was no economy to speak of, no employment. The blockade continued. The Allied blockade continued for months after the armistice was signed, and people were blaming the democratic government for their suffering. And then the Nazis in the shadows were producing propaganda saying it's all the Jews' fault. And so Bell was, desperately warning Britain what was happening, that this British-led embargo, French-led embargo was cutting the knees out from under democracy. And he said, we need to get German business started again. And there is no way for this to begin organically. No bankers will lend money because the risk is too great. These industrial concerns have no collateral to pledge. The only way things can get going is if we get them credits in a private-public consortium. Private finance would put up the money. The government would backstop it against losses. But Bell said, don't worry, there won't be any losses. It's going to make a lot of money. But the plan was, with those credits, German industry could buy raw materials and begin working on it. That would create employment. As of 1919, the only real employment was in these mercenary armies of the extremists. So instead of that being the only avenue to getting bread on the table, people would instead be able to get to work in the factories. That would create tax revenue that would fund the German government, and then the extremists would just wither away. Bell pushed this plan after World War II, and at that point there was an appetite for it, and that became the Marshall Plan, to be able to grant Germany credits so that democracy can get off the ground. And one of the things that's little studied in history was there was a very similar pro-Nazi movement in Germany through the late 40s and 50s. The leading Nazis went into the shadows, began planning again, created propaganda, anti-British, anti-Jewish, etc. But the second time it withered away because people had better things to do. They had work in the factories and work in business. Democracy was off the ground, rather than it being democracy full of promises and the Nazis being the one with jobs on offer.
Okay, at this point, I do have more questions, but I'd like to ask if anyone here has any questions. If you do, we have a roving mic. I'd like to use it to ask your question. Does anybody here have any questions at this point?
In your book, and you alluded to, you refer to the Nazi movement earlier as a leftist movement, a participative sense, fighting communism, they align themselves together to defeat the government. It's just a tactical move. There's always philosophically believe the National German Workers' Party. And particularly in today's environment, it's interesting to understand whether the anti-Semitism that's right. At the same time, whether incorporation. So it's really quite a broad support to Nazism. But I'm curious to understand how Bell was looking at the Nazis in the political spectrum.
Thanks. I can see it. Like the last 20 seconds came through loud and clear, but I totally missed the first part of it. Lance, would you mind repeating that the question?
Okay.
Yeah, just hold it right up to your mouth.
I don't record my comments.
Just ask the last question.
Where in the selection? Okay, no, I need to reface it because in your book you address the NSA, you identify the NSA even that it was a socialist movement that Winthrop Bell described it. At the same time you had a military backing and you had German enterprise supporting it, particularly in the context of today's world. I'm curious to see how he viewed the Nazi movement vis-a-vis the political spectrum. Left to right. Is it leftist? Was it rightist? Where did he look at it?
Okay, I this time I got about 90% of it, so I'm gonna try to answer this as best I can, and tell me if I'm off track here. So basically, let me start with the formation of the National Socialists, and then let me go back in time to what it looked like before. Well, actually, let me take this the other way. So in March 1919, Winthrop was in Berlin, where there was nasty fighting going on between the so-called rightists and the so-called leftists. Now, I say so-called because Bell said the troops that were doing the fighting had no political motivations. So they were mercenaries simply for money, and that was it. He talked to these people. They were not politically motivated. He said when their officers are not looking and they're shooting at the other side, they're intentionally missing. They're firing at soldiers on the other side that they had just been in the trenches with them. So the soldiers were not ideologically motivated, but the money that was coming in was ideologically motivated. So there was communist money coming in from Moscow to support the leftists, and then some of the great industrial concerns, particularly the ones that had gotten rich off of armaments, and the great landowners, and some of the aristocrats, particularly those in the eastern parts of the German Empire, were the ones funding the right-wing movement. And in terms of strength, the leftists had a lot more soldiers under their command, so it was like a couple of a million. Leftists, as opposed to only about 100,000 in the right-wing movement. And yet, the right-wing movement, Bell said, had the officers' support, they had the heavy weaponry, they had national organization. So what you see going on in the early part of 1919 is that the right wing is winning all of its battles, and yet it's like playing a game of whack-a-mole against the left. So they go to Munich, they win there. They go to Bremen, they win there. They go to Berlin, they win there. And yet they're not winning because there are these millions of leftists under arms. And that was the status quo, was this left-wing versus right-wing fight. Again, hardly motivated by any ideology among the soldiers, only motivated by ideology at the level of the funders. And then in April of 1919, there's a meeting at the Hotel Eden, which was the right-wing headquarters after they had won the battle for Berlin, in which some of these militant communists come and meet with the leading figures of the right-wing movement, and they agree to merge their forces as National Socialism. So that's the birth of the Nazi Party, so to speak. This is prior to Hitler's formalization of it a year later. There were reasons, as I discussed in the book, why they chose Hitler to do this a year later. But long before this ragtag group got together in Munich, Bell saying this group is powerful, well organized, with leading political and military figures in it in Berlin, with immense strength. So it wasn't all the leftists who joined, but a significant number. And at that moment, Moscow, the Stalin, Stalin, of course, be the leader in the future of the whole nation, of the whole Soviet Empire, but even in 1919, he was an influential figure. Basically, the right wing in Germany and the Soviets agree to stop fighting, but they pretend that they're still fighting because these right wing movements in Germany are being funded by Britain, thinking that they're fighting communism. So Bell is instrumental in getting that line of funding cut off by pointing out through his intelligence reports that there is no fighting going on in Eastern Europe, despite all of these claims that there are. Instead, the Soviets have agreed to start despoiling the population in their part of Europe, and the right-wing Nazis in their part of Europe. So this is the beginning of a cooperation plan that history had known nothing about. It's in Bell's records. The Ribbentrop-Molotov agreement that formalized the peace treaty and the plan to carve up Europe along Soviet and German lines just before World War II began, came as a lot of surprise to communists throughout the world, but the roots were already there in 1919. So why did that happen? Bell said it was simply for pragmatic reasons, and I use pragmatic here in the bad sense of pragmatism, not the good sense, because the powers that be in Berlin in this racist movement realized they could never win unless they had a lot more troops, and the way they could get them was through carving off a lot of these leftist troops for themselves. And not all the leftists were on board. Through the 1920s, there were running street battles among some of the communists in the right wing, but a lot of the leftists joined in 1919, and that was enough to tip the balance. And by October, November 1919, Bell was warning Britain that this group, the new National Socialist Nazi group, was the strongest party in Germany, and they could take over Germany, he said, anytime they wanted. They just didn't want to yet because the country was so economically weak. They didn't want to be the ones holding the bag when it all fell apart. They wanted democracy to take the blame. Yeah, I don't know if I answered all of your question. I caught about 90% of it, but how National Socialism formed as an alliance between the right and the Soviet faction was spring, April in particular of 1919.
Yes, George is shaking his head, nodding.
Okay, great.
So we're getting kind of near the end. I'd like to ask a question here. From your book, what are the takeaway lessons that we can learn from Winthrop Bell, your research and your book?
I think, for me, the takeaway that I was aiming for when I was writing the book is that we really need to study Bell's method for creating peace after war. And people have gotten very, very, very good at fighting wars over the years, and we have fantastic technologies that are getting better and better and better. But we don't have the same peace technology. So how is it that we can create conditions particularly in defeated countries, so that young people see a path for an economically productive democratic future, rather than seeing their only line as being to become a terrorist and get some money. And well before I wrote the book, I encountered this through my own brother, who was an American soldier in Iraq. And his point was very much like Winthrop Bell's point. A lot of these people that we're fighting are not ideological at all. They're young men who are trying to provide for their family. The bad actors are the ones who are funding this behind the scenes. We're always going to have bad actors with us. But how is it that we can keep that circle as small as possible so it's not infecting 16, 17, 18-year-old boys? And that's, I think, the failure that we've kept on implementing in recent wars that have been fought. The war seems like it's been won, but it creates these conditions for future terrorism. The exception to this is the Marshall Plan after World War II, which took a really dangerous cauldron and turned it into a peaceable future for Europe. For bizarre reasons, we've kind of taken that as a once-off rather than being a standard model. But I think that should absolutely be something that we revisit. I'm now editing a journal, the Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence Studies, that makes this case in reference to modern conflicts. But the other thing, the other takeaway is, I think that people of all ethnicities and religions need to be particularly sensitive about the allure of anti-Semitism. And the way that anti-Semitism begins by murderous people who want to steal stuff, but they're never going to be satisfied with stealing and murdering from the Jews, and this is going to extend to other groups. So I'm trying to argue for solidarity, particularly with Jewish people, because I think we see the historical pattern again and again. But solidarity with oppressed groups before the situation gets even worse. Now, obviously, there's reasons to be opposed to anti-Semitism in itself, but I'm also worried about the way that this spreads, and when more groups can see that eventually they'll be targeted in the fullness of time to stand with Jews when these attacks first happen. That this is all of our problems and not just a Jewish problem. And that's something I think has been sadly lacking in these last couple of years. People have looked at anti-Semitic attacks as if they're just targeting Jews rather than being a threat to culture and to civilization itself. And I think we need to be nervous, not just about what happened 70 or 80 years ago, but how the conditions can happen again, and there's bad actors who want those conditions to happen again.
You hit a very strong chord here in this room, obviously, with this conference. And I know you're not Jewish, but I know that you feel very strongly about this. It's appreciated. So what's in the future for you? I know you've written a number of articles, and some journals. You may have more research for another book, or this has been all encompassing. You have been absolutely outstanding, phenomenal result of this book.
Well, thank you very much. I can say, it's kind of taken me in a strange direction I would not have anticipated earlier, but I was curious about, so Winthrop Bell warned an American Hungarian named Francis Deák in the spring of 1939 about Hitler's plans for the Holocaust. Deák asked him to send some copies of this warning for the purposes of sending this around to the State Department. And I followed this path to find this remarkable but virtually unknown OSS secret operation into Hungary during World War II to trick Hitler into thinking that's where D-Day was going to happen, through southeastern Europe instead of France. And so a three-man crack OSS team parachuted into Hungary to pull Hungary out of the war, to prevent the Holocaust there, but also to distract Hitler. And the mission was called Operation Sparrow, and it worked to a remarkable degree. A month after the landing at Normandy, Hitler was still convinced that Normandy was a feint, and that the real attack was going to happen through southeastern Europe. He kept hundreds of thousands of troops, in fact, well over 1 million, in that theater. If those same troops had been in France, D-Day would have been impossible. The invasion could have not have happened in Normandy. But the story has been unknown because of the Cold War. Soviet Union and the Western democracies were competing for spheres of influence. So that's my next book. It's called Operation Sparrow, coming out HarperCollins in the fall of 2026. And I'm neck deep in that story now. So deep in the archives, and I come up for air to teach my students. But it's been all encompassing. But it's a lot of fun to realize the smart people who came together to put an end to Nazi evil.
Wonderful. I'm going to hand the microphone over to Joanne.
Jason, I'd like to thank you firstly for writing this book, and secondly for letting the world know about this very modest, secretive Winthrop Bell, a Canadian that I think we're proud to learn about. And thank you for this very interesting discussion. Thanks also to the Katzman family, Louis David Katzman Fund supports Temple's relationship with the Jewish Book Council. Thanks to Lance for recommending this book and leading the discussion this evening. And I'd like to acknowledge the book rating committee, particularly Fern Gitter and our staff liaison, Anne Rosenfield. Thanks to Temple staff, office staff, and maintenance staff who makes programs like this possible. And lastly, thank you all for that's really what makes this program possible. And we hope you'll consider registering for Sinai Cinema on Saturday, November 16th